This is my project presentation for my final research paper on the moral economies and grassroots social process methodologies of food sovereignty movements. Let's get started. So to begin with kind of the problem statement of the research paper, I am focusing on the problem of the neoliberal economy, or the neoliberal economic paradigm, which I argue from my research to be a flawed system due to several factors. Some of the key ones that I discuss are the banking model of education that's promoted by the neoliberal economy and paradigm. Especially in food systems, this promotes conventional extension methods of agriculture, that eliminate the sovereignty and autonomy of farmers by forcing them to rely on conventional and top-down methods of change for their farming systems. And I also focus on the corporate food regime as expressed and described by McMichael, and Shiva's corporate myth. Vandana Shiva discusses the way that neoliberalism has perpetuated a norm that industrialism and globalization, as well as the privatization and individualism of profit, are the ways to solve human and ecological crises, especially in food production, such as the myth that only industrial agriculture can feed the world by 2050. I employ two primary theoretical frameworks. The first is the concept of a moral economy that was originally conceptualized by E.P. Thompson in the context of peasant rebellion, and later progressed by James Scott as well as other prominent scholars. And an easy way to understand a moral economy at a very basic level is morals in all policies. So this is kind of playing off of the phrase of health in all policies, in that a moral economy expresses that an economy should be centered on and created from morality and moral values rather than values of profit. And this moral economy focuses really well into the context of food sovereignty, and I argue that it is a really helpful framework for understanding an alternative economic paradigm to the dominant neoliberal paradigm that food sovereignty could embrace as a useful framework. The second theoretical framework that I draw on is Paulo Freire's idea of critical consciousness, formation or formação, and the diálogo de saberes, which is a dialogue between ways of knowing. And all of this I fit under the category of Freirean social process methodology. And these two frameworks tie well together into my argument, which we'll get to later, but both focus on the moral economy and the social process of food sovereignty as a solution to the problem of neoliberalism. So to move into the literature review, first I'll start with the moral economy. As I mentioned before, E.P. Thompson was the first scholar to publicly conceptualize this concept, and he focused on a very radical form of this concept, not only that morals are integral to a healthy economy, but that they are the economy. They inform and create the economy. And James Scott, although he doesn't mention E.P. Thompson very much in his works, expanded this idea into a closer study of the way that peasant rebellions can express and cultivate an alternative economy to the colonial and free market economy that often degrades peasant lifestyles. And James Scott focuses on case studies of Vietnam and Burma in his analysis of the realm of possibility, or again, this idea of the politics of the possible in peasant rebellion and draws on the idea of a moral economy as one way to expand peasant sovereignty. Now, Polanyi was another scholar who advanced the idea of a moral economy, and it's important to note the distinction between Thompson and Scott's conceptualization and Polanyi's. Polanyi focused on the idea of embeddedness, that is, that morals are embedded within an economy. And this is distinct from Thompson's radical initial concept that morals are the economy. So there's a shift there, and that's important to note. And I'd mainly draw on Thompson's conceptualization, but I also analyze this idea of embeddedness as a transition. Now, the other author I'd want to include in this part of the literature review is Fassin, and he takes an interesting approach on the idea of a moral economy, sort of switching the words around to an economy of morals. So not only how the morals create an economy in policy and practice and infrastructure, but also, and this is quoted, the production, distribution, circulation, and use of moral feelings. So this ties into the concept of social reproduction of space and of values that we've discussed in class. And I think this is the transition from the framework of a moral economy. Rather, this is the connection between the framework of a moral economy and the framework of Freirean social process methodology, in that the economy of morals is a way for social movements within the food sovereignty network to circulate and distribute and produce alternative morals to the neoliberal norms that are dominant within much of society. Moving into that second framework, now the Freirean education and campesino a campesino social process methodology, and I draw mainly on three sources for this framework. The first is Paulo Freire's concept of critical education as expressed in his book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And as I mentioned before, this book raises several concepts that are directly in opposition to the neoliberal economic paradigm and social paradigm that emphasizes banking methods of education. Now, Freire contrasts that with a problem-posing form of education that raises critical consciousness and formulates a whole being. And I also draw from two case studies, one from Cuba and the National Association of Small Farmers, as well as the campesino a campesino, or farmer-to-farmer educational methodology used in Cuba to scale out agroecology. And this is mainly expressed by Peter Rosset and Elena Martinez Torres. And I also examine the case study of the landless workers movement, or the MST, in Brazil, to draw on the grassroots social process methodology and evolving moral economy of the MST. And I utilize works from David Meek and other authors for this case study. So my findings and conclusions, which I'll get to next. To start off with the lessons from the case studies and research, one key takeaway from my research is the power of scale. And this is not just in terms of geographical scale, but social scale, and the way that localization and anti-globalist alternative movements have radical potential to evolve communities and economies that can exist directly in contrast to a neoliberal economic paradigm and still be able to thrive within the broader dominant neoliberal paradigm. And so that's a key point, is that the scale is part of the realm of possibility and in some ways determines the realm of possibility. And now my intervention in my research paper is that a moral economy of education based on Freirean social process methodology is a necessary foundation to, firstly, deconstruct the neoliberal economic paradigm, and secondly, to ensure that food sovereignty movements prefigurative politics cultivate the principles of food sovereignty, namely cultivating nutritionally healthy, culturally appropriate and equitable, and ecologically sustainable food systems. And so those two pieces, my intervention is that food sovereignty movements and organizations must focus on their own social process methodologies, or in other words, focus on the how of their organization. How are they advancing their goals, and what kind of world are they creating through their own prefigurative politics? And I argue this because the case studies of Cuba and Brazil demonstrate that a focus on the educational method of food sovereignty is really essential to scaling out and scaling up the concept of food sovereignty. And so I'll get into that more here in our conclusions. So my conclusions, therefore, are that food sovereignty social movement organizations, especially those in the global north and or those that exist within deeply embedded neoliberal norms, must pay special attention to developing a moral economy of education. And this is crucial because often those organizations in the global north or existing within neoliberal norms, as we've seen, have a tendency to perpetuate or contribute to the extant social inequities and structural inequities in which they exist. For example, the unbearable whiteness found in alternative food movements in the global north, especially in North America in some cases, can be countered and deconstructed by developing a more dialogical, horizontal, and diverse form of social process within those organizations, in which there's a mutual learning and not this idea of one dominant knowledge. And secondly, my conclusion is that a moral economy of education is necessary, as I said before, to scaling out and up the theory and movement of food sovereignty as a critical response to neoliberalism and its attendant human and ecological crises. So to unpack that a little bit, I argue that a moral economy of education is the most effective and necessary carrier for food sovereignty in terms of, some scholars we've looked at have said that peasants are the social carrier for food sovereignty, and I would argue that a moral economy of education is the way that peasants and other food sovereignty activists and participants and advocates can express this critical theory effectively as a critique and an alternative to neoliberalism. So that's an overview of my presentation. I hope that was illuminating in some ways, and I look forward to seeing what all of you have chosen to research. Thanks.